Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. More antibody testing is being done in particular locales. We mentioned the Santa Clara County testing that was done by our friend Dr. Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford.
Everybody's talking about that. That's the one study that I think opened people's eyes. You know, maybe more of us have it than we think.
Yeah, although, there was another study out yesterday from USC of LA County. The outbreak in LA County could be up to 55 times bigger than the number of confirmed cases, according to USC researchers, the research done in conjunction with the LA Department of Public Health. Their preliminary results found that an estimated 4.1% of the county's adult population has antibodies to the coronavirus. So that's between, their estimate is between 221,000 and 442,000 adults in LA County. That's 28 to 55 times higher than the 8,000 confirmed cases reported in the county through early April. Same sort of thing in Santa Clara County. The caveat to that, well, there's a couple. One is there are, when we get to Dr. J, not the Virginia Squires, Philadelphia Sixers Dr. J, but the Dr. J from Stanford, back on the show to address the criticisms of the methodology of his study. Got to address criticisms. You know, this is all preliminary, hasn't been peer reviewed. The other caveat I would add is you're still talking about, and again, the numbers were similar in Santa Clara, 2 to 4% in LA County. So that's not the 25 to 50% that some were projecting was the percentage of the population that had been infected but asymptomatic and had developed antibodies. And so the rest of the population, the percentage of the population that is truly still vulnerable to the virus is much smaller than imagined. You're still only talking about 4%. That still leaves a huge percentage, obviously the overwhelming majority of the population that still has threat of exposure. So it's good to get this information, and hopefully we'll be getting more of it to do a better job modeling and understanding what the potential downside is, if you will. But it's not as encouraging as finding out that 25, 50% of the population has it. We've developed herd immunity, and it's a very small percentage of the population that still has a real threat, that still faces a real threat from the virus. Those numbers don't tell us that, I don't believe. For more on the whole topic of testing, what we know and what we don't know, we're pleased to be joined by Jack Lipton. He is a Ph.D. He's chair and professor of translational neuroscience at Michigan State University. Jack Lipton, thanks so much for joining us. Say hi to Sparty for us.
I'll do that.
Yes, thanks
for having me on.
So you and your colleague, Professor Sortwell, had this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about a test that has been developed there at Michigan State, and you want to use it, a COVID-19 test, and you want to use it, but you're not able to use it, and you want to be able to use it. So tell us the story of you got this test, and why can't you use it?
So we'd read a report that came out of university in Wuhan, China, on an assay that they had developed there, and I worked with Carol Sortwell and one of our other assistant professors, Joe Patterson. We looked at it and said, could we adapt this and check it out? Because we're neuroscientists. We usually work in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease, so this isn't our area, but we do molecular biology, and we work with viruses all the time for therapeutics. So we thought we could take this test and adapt it. The test was reported to be about 500 times more sensitive than the standard test that's used to detect the virus. It reduces the number of false positives or false negatives, so people that get missed by the standard test. Since it's more sensitive, we can detect more people. So we decided to develop this test, make sure that this report out of China was valid. And so we took it, we adapted it, kind of made it our own. And we have it working. So we're using it for research purposes right now. So we can test humans through human subject studies, but we can't use the test clinically. And the reason that we can't is because research laboratories are not licensed to offer clinical diagnostic testing. So this is related to some legislation that was passed in 1988, which is it's in effect for good reason, right? The idea of having some regulations to make sure that laboratories that give you your tests for cholesterol or vitamin deficiencies or viral tests are consistently giving reliable and robust information back to patients, and a lab in New York gives you the same information that a lab in Nebraska does. But right now, those regulations prevent us from using that test or even the regular standard CDC-approved test because they won't allow university labs to do this work.
Have you reached out to any state lawmakers to try and change the law?
So we have. We've talked to people in the state, and this is a federal law. So the idea, the thing that's interesting about it is the federal government produces the regulations for CLIA, or Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, which is what it's called, and then the states have to enforce it and make sure that it's working. So each state has its own state lab. Like for us in Michigan, we have the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. They regulate it, but it's based upon the federal statute. So we talked to both federal and state lawmakers about this issue.
But this seems to me this is a Scott Hahn issue. This is FDA doing a waiver of this law, or obviously with the assent of the president. But that's really what we're talking about here, whether it's through a state agency or your members of Congress or directly to the FDA. They should just be waiving this restriction.
Yeah, and they have relaxed a lot of rules. So some of the rules that are in place, you have to use very specific chemicals to do the work, and they have eased some of those. They allow research use only materials to be used, and they're making it available. They have these accelerated processes called EUAs, or emergency use authorizations, where individuals, laboratories can put in they have a new test. They go, hey, I have a new test. I want you to validate it. Here's the data I have on it, and they'll say, sure, use it. Even though we haven't approved it, you're still authorized to use it. So there are ways that they've been relaxing things in the pandemic to try and make things easier. But this one thing, this CLIA accreditation, which laboratories like Quest Diagnostics have CLIA accreditation, other hospital laboratories do, but we can't. And if they could ease that one piece, we can still do everything with the same amount of rigor and follow the FDA protocols to demonstrate we have a working test.
So have you gotten?
But we just can't.
Have you gotten feedback in terms of why you haven't received that waiver?
Well, I think it requires some political will, right? People have to be willing to say we're going to do this, and exactly whether it comes from the state, where the state's going to say this seems sufficient for us. Because there seems to be a lot of back and forth between what the federal government says its responsibility is and the states. And so if it's a mandate from the federal government, but the states have to, regulate it based upon the federal government guidelines, there's a lot of finger pointing there. And also whether this can be taken care of by executive order or whether it has to involve legislation. I'm not an attorney, so when I read the statute, I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah, it sounds like something the FDA could work around if they were so motivated.
Yeah, and aren't there tens of thousands of similar academic research labs that are going through the same thing, that have they can test COVID for COVID-19, but they're not being able to or allowed to?
Yeah, so the actual test that's being used, the CDC sanctioned test, the one that is mostly being performed in order to examine whether subjects have the virus on board, is a pretty simple test for laboratories like ours. And there are several laboratories, thousands of laboratories all across the country that have the equipment and the know-how to do it. And if we were able to get all of those labs working, we could probably get 500,000 to 1 million samples per day running. That's a big difference.
It is a big difference.
Yeah,
so it could also
it's
get
a game
us
changer.
Could also get us to more representative sampling too, sort of down the continuum of testing. No, I'm glad Wall Street Journal picked it up. I'm glad you guys are pushing on your elected and bureaucratic representatives on this. I wonder though, since you are a neuroscientist and I am not, I'm still completing my home study course.
Good.
Yes, yeah. So there has been reports about the neurological impact of COVID-19, and I wonder if you or your colleagues have actually studied the virus at all and those reported neurological impacts.
No, I've been reading some of those reports as well, and everything's so new right now. Exactly what what those are and what the the penetrance of that, what percentage of people have neurological complications. There's so many different things that we don't know about this yet, and trying to understand cofactors that may just be aggravating existing conditions in people that get the virus versus actual changes in neurological function as a result of the virus. Right now we really can't figure that out. And the virus does produce a lot of inflammation. So that's one of the big things, right? Your lungs get inflamed. You can't, fluid builds up. You can't breathe. And so once you have large amounts of inflammation that are floating around through the body, and this occurs because your body's immune reaction releases a bunch of chemicals that cause inflammation. That's used to help clear an infection. But at the same time, that inflammation hurts you. And so that's something that is very commonly known in neurological disorders. So if you have a stroke, there's inflammation associated with that injury, and it produces additional brain damage. So understanding whether it's the virus's effect on inflammation, which is producing neurological problems, or if the virus is actually producing direct changes in the brain, is really a question that needs to be answered.
What's your perspective on the antibody testing that is slowly getting rolled out finally here? But that's been another source of frustration, at least for me, I think some others too, in terms of why that couldn't have been on parallel tracks earlier, but it's starting now. We've got a few case studies that we were talking about before we brought you on. What's your perspective?
I'm really concerned about, so in some ways, when we talked about the viral test, right, there's all of these regulations that prevent us from doing testing with a proven test. All of these antibody tests are starting to come out, and it's clear that a lot of the antibody tests, they're manufactured in China, and they're based upon materials that are produced there, and the government has allowed all of these tests to come without really doing appropriate validation. So I'm actually very concerned that a lot of these antibody tests are giving false positive results because the test itself can cross-react with other viral particles. And so if you've had exposure to other coronaviruses, like some colds can be produced by a coronavirus, there's cross-reactivity there. And so you may show up and think, hey, I'm safe, I got coronavirus, I'm good to go, when it's actually registering some other infection that you've had previously. So I'm actually concerned that those tests are going to be a little bit too permissive in allowing people to go back to work. And I think it's really important to get those antibody tests working. But right now, there seems to be a lot of concern, and a large proportion of those tests, which are coming from multiple manufacturers, may not be as rigorous as we hoped.
Are you comfortable, would you be comfortable saying to an employer, if the antibody tests available aren't as reliable as we would hope them to be, if you do a temperature check of your employees before they enter the workplace, that's sufficient for now until more and better testing comes online? I'm sorry? Hello? Oh, did we lose him?
Yeah.
No. All right. All right. Well, that was Jack Lipton, Chair and Professor of Translational Neuroscience at Michigan State University. Jack Lipton, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's what Chicago is talking about. It's Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy on AM 560. The Answer.
This is attorney Stephen Leahy, host of the IRS Radio Hour, heard right here